Hello and welcome to the Srijan Wednesday webinars. If you're joining us for the first time, this is an initiative by Srijan Technologies where we have industry experts come in and discuss the emerging technologies and speak about how industries can drive their digital transformation. For today's session, we have with us Ishan Mahajan, Drupal Practice Head at Srijan Technologies. Ishan will be speaking about the intricacies of content modeling, the challenges that might come up during content modeling, and especially with unstructured content, and discuss the four key approaches that one can take to solve the challenges that come up with unstructured content modeling. So, without any further ado, let's just go ahead and start the session. I would like to remind all our listeners that if you have any questions, you can write to us and we will take them up at the end of the session. And so, without further ado, let's get started with it. Ishan, over to you.
Thanks, Nilanjana. Hi, everybody. This is Ishan. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. And as Nilanjana mentioned, today I'm going to talk about content modeling with respect to Drupal. And the concept would apply to other CMSs as well, but we'll look at a couple of demos of the Drupal CMS. So before we start, let's talk a little bit about content modeling. What exactly does that mean? It may mean it may have a different meaning for different people. So just want to set some uh, base here and talk specifically about what we mean when we talk about content modeling, especially with respect to Drupal or a CMS, and how does a development team look at it. So it is a critical part of a project, essentially because a lot of different parts of the projects depend on your content model, and the effects of your content model is not only immediate. They may affect your website or your website redesign 2 to 3 years down the line as well. So this is actually a very critical aspect of any website redesign project, and there's a tendency to sometimes not pay enough attention to it. And there are different ways to maintain a content model or how you approach documenting it. One of the most common ways and effective ways is to start documenting your content model in an Excel sheet or a Google sheet. And what are the kind of things you cover in a content model? Essentially, all your different entities. So you have your content types, your different blocks, your different taxonomies. If you're using a paragraph module in Drupal, then you would start defining the content model for that as well. And this is a live document that you would maintain throughout the life cycle of your project. So here's a screenshot of what, like an article profile. Uh, Say you have a music, you have a website for managing different music artists, and you're maintaining an artist profile. So this is how you would start documenting your content model by defining the name of the fields, what type of fields you would have, and adding some description and some data around whether it's required and things like that. And this is what feeds into the requirements, and this is what the developers pick up. So as I said, content models can have a long lasting effect on your website, especially a CMS website. So why is it so important? Firstly, the way you model your content dictates how flexible the CMS is for editors and for whoever will be using your CMS. So it also means that throughout the life cycle of the project, and even once your project goes live, how easy it is for you to accommodate changes or last minute feedback, that is really dictated by your content model. And we'll see that in today's webinar. We'll go over a couple of different approaches, and you'll see between the different approaches how the flexibility changes and what kind of flexibility the different approaches bring in. Content model also determines how easy your next redesign will be. So how you define the content model really impacts, say 2 years, 3 years down the line when you have to redesign your website. Uh, how complex would it be to migrate your content? especially if you're going from one CMS to another. If you choose another technology down the line, how easy would it be for you to migrate the content? That all depends on how you've modeled your content. Again, changing the design or updating the design of your website is also very tightly coupled with your content model. If you have a content model that's decoupled with your design to whatever extent is possible in a CMS like Drupal, it'll be much easier for you to redesign your front end. But if your content model is really coupled with your design, then redesigning your front end would also mean that you would need developers to change your content model as well, which might lead to migration of content as well. So it really changes the whole complexity of a redesign exercise. And the way you model your content also dictates the reusability of your components. So this is again something that we will see in today's webinar. We'll go over a couple of demos and I'll show you how you can reuse or may lose the ability to reuse content depending on the approach that you take. So first let's talk about content and how we typically classify content. So in every CMS project, we typically classify content into two different categories. One category is what we refer to as structured content. Structured content, you can think of content such as news, articles, blogs, webinar events, things essentially which editors would typically uh, enter the content in the form of a form. So if you're familiar with Drupal, you can think of it as a content type, and an editor would go in the backend and fill out the fields in a form. And there's very little that the editors are bothered about with respect to the front end. So these are fixed templates. There might be some changes that they may want depending on different version of the content, but overall the structure of the page, the template of the page remains the same. So if you look at any news media publishing website, all of the news content would essentially follow the same template. There might be different versions. For example, the sponsored content might look different, or there may be special long form articles and special templates, but majority of the content would look the same. And that is what we bucket under the category of structured content. So here is an example of a very recent project that we worked on. We redesigned and developed the monotype.com website, and this is how their resource content type looks like, which is what they use for case studies and webinars and blog posts. So as you can see, in this kind of a template, the title would always come over here. There would be a hero section. So whether you want to highlight a video or a image or a quote in this case, it'll always come at the top over here. And then you have the body section, within which you can definitely include some rich multimedia and other components. But the overall template of the page remains the same. You have the content in the middle, you have the tags and some metadata on the left, including the social share buttons, and then you have some blocks on the right. So this is what we would classify as structured content type. And what we will be focusing on today is essentially unstructured content. Because as far as structured content is concerned, I think Drupal has a very mature approach, and there isn't much that can go wrong over there, to be honest. But where we run into issues and where we've seen a lot of issues in the past CMS and Drupal projects is with respect to unstructured content. And unstructured content is what you can think of is your homepage, which is typically a unique design, or if you're creating a landing page showing content from a particular topic, or if the marketing team is creating a campaign page, or it could be a special article page as well. Uh, how do you approach these kind of pages? Because generally these are pages that are put together by editors or somebody who's managing the CMS. So not necessarily a developer, right? So this is a page where uh, your editors would want different components, which could be in the form of blocks or paragraphs or even fields on a content type, and they would be stitching together these pages. So there is no fixed design or template. Uh, there are of course guardrails. They might have some predefined templates, some regions, some pre-built components, but how the page will eventually look totally depends on the editor, right, and what they do with it. So how do we approach these kind of unstructured content and these pages? So let's start with what you should avoid, right? So we'll talk about four particular approaches today in this webinar, but there are many, many more ways you can do this in Drupal, for example. And what we've seen is one of the ways, which is actually very common, and is having too many content types. So I took the example of an article, right? A news article, and I said, what if you want to change the template a little bit? Uh, Maybe it is sponsored content and you want to change the background color, for example. Maybe it uses a different font. Maybe there are a couple of extra fields that you need on the sponsored content article. You don't want to create a separate content type for that, because this is something that can go completely out of control, and you may end up, as you get more and more requirements and more variations, you'll keep on creating more content types when those content types are sharing about 80%, 90% of the fields. This is just going to cause a lot of maintenance overhead, and will introduce a lot of issues, plus will mean that fixing something would require a lot of regression testing, plus you'll have to roll it out to different content types. So this is something that you definitely want to avoid. uh, Another tempting approach is to keep on adding fields to a single content type. So okay, you need a gray background to an article, let's add a checkbox. You click that checkbox and you get a gray background. Again, this can go completely out of hand. If you know what you're doing, if it's just a matter of a couple of fields, then it's all right. But you don't want to go too deep into this approach. This is one of those things that can cause a lot of issues with your next redesign or your next migration, because what you're essentially doing is you're letting your content model be completely coupled with your design, and you're letting the design dictate your content model. So the next time your design changes, of course, that means you have to completely rebuild your content model from scratch. So we've talked about some of the pitfalls and what are things that you want to avoid. Uh, so now let's talk about what are the different approaches that do work well, right? And that you should consider in your next project. So the first approach is actually does not require any contributed modules. You can do this as part of Drupal core, and you can use use the Drupal's templating and theming layer to achieve this. And this is a good approach for simpler use cases where uh, the content structure is not really changing. And when you want to create a new landing page, for example, or a new page, the content structure is essentially the same, but you just want some minor variations, right? And you don't want developers to do that all the time. So to give you a quick example, I've spoken about this use case a couple of times. We have this article content type on one of our client projects, and as you can see, uh, between these two articles, there's a slight variation that when it's a sponsored content, there is some extra fields that show up on the template. So you have this widget at the top which says sponsored, then you get some messaging around it, and you'll also notice that since it's a sponsored content, there are no ads on this article, whereas there are ads on this non-sponsored article. So to do these kind of changes, and there are more variations as well, where there might be a couple of other things that change. For example, the background color might change, or the font might also change. Now, to do this, again, do not create a different content type called sponsored article. You can do this with the same content type. And if you go to approach one, what you would do here is you would simply uh, add a couple of settings to your core content type. And depending on whether the article is sponsored, for example, you can use Drupal's theme and templating layer to just use a different template for the front end or make changes to your front end. So this is a good approach for simpler use cases. But if you see that the editors need a lot more flexibility in terms of changing the design, and if they want to change the structure of the page itself, the layout of the page itself, then this approach will not scale. You will have to look at some other options. And that is where we get into our approach two, which is one such approach. So there's a module in Drupal which is very popular called paragraphs. You can use this to create your landing pages. This actually, out of the four approaches, this is the approach that actually gets you structured content. So even though we're talking about unstructured content use cases here, like building your homepage or a landing page, uh, this is the most, I would say, API friendly approach. So you can use this paragraph module to even build your landing pages on a decoupled Drupal application as well, right? Where you are not using Drupal as the front end, but you're using uh, a JavaScript framework such as React for your framework for your front end application. This works really well with that as well. The other advantage is that the components that you add, you can make them reusable. So there are extensions to the paragraph module that allow you to reuse the paragraph content that you create, and you reuse these components across different component content types. Uh, Another benefit of this approach is that you can easily add new components. So one of the things I mentioned in the introduction is uh, the way you approach your content model also dictates how easily you're able to accommodate last minute changes or feedbacks or enhancements that you need to do. So if you are using paragraphs in your content type, you can very easily add a new content type. Sorry, add a new paragraph to your content type. So it's really flexible in that sense. Uh, some of the disadvantages of this approach might be that it does tie your content model to your front end design, and then we'll jump into a demo of this straight away, and you'll see what I'm referring to. So this is really great if you want to create stacked pages like you see in the screenshot. So if you have one component after the other in a single column, this works really well. But if you want to create multiple columns, or if you want to move things, you want to swap things from left to right column, things like that, you start adding that configuration to your paragraph, and then that means that you're coupling your content type, content model with your designs. So that is one of the disadvantages of this approach. So let's actually take a look at one example. So we have a demo site here. So this is called Easy Content. This is a Drupal 8 starter kit that Srijan maintains for our marketing and media and publishing projects. And this Drupal distribution actually supports all the four approaches that we were talking about today, right? And depending on the project, you can select the approach that's most suitable. So let's look at the paragraphs approach first. So uh, if you have to create a landing page such as this, so if you have a hero component at the top, for example, followed by card components, you can see the way the editors would approach this, and the editorial experience will be they click on edit and they're taken to the backend. And the thing with paragraphs is that all the management would be done in the backend uh, in the content type forms. So here is my component library in the form of paragraphs, and I can keep on adding components here. I've already added a hero component and a card component. Each of these components can have their own set of configurations. So for example, the card component here allows me to add an image, a title, short title, some description, and I can provide a CTA at the bottom. So what this does is, as I mentioned, it's really great when you have a stacked layout. And in this case, for example, if I have to simply move this, so here is my paragraph page. If I want to reorder things, so if I want to move the hero component below the card component, I can simply drag and drop the cards component at the top and change the order and hit save. So you can see the hero component is at the bottom now. So this is the editorial experience that your editors would have if you're using paragraphs. As I said, it's really great for stacked layout. It's actually structured content, so it's really great for exposing as an API if you are using a decoupled setup. And we'll explore uh, how is it different from the other approaches. And as I mentioned, when you have to manipulate the layout or the template in the front end, that's where you may not see as much flexibility with paragraphs as you may with the other approaches that we talk about today. The third approach that we have is called entity embed. So what this module does is this is the most familiar tools for editors, especially who've been using CMSs. This allows you to build your unstructured content pages using the WYSIWYG editor, right? Something like a Seek editor. So you write all of your content into the Seek editor, and you can embed your components within the uh, WYSIWYG editor itself. So what that means is it's a good way to keep your HTML out of your body. So you're still maintaining and building your components outside of the body field. So you can, for example, your image, slideshow, a photo gallery, or a pull quote. All these could be different components that you build as entities, and then you can simply embed them within your body field. But what this does is this is really powerful, but then it's also very prone to abuse, right? Because there is no uh, fixed layout, there is no guardrails around how the page will look like. So the editors, depending on their skill level and their comfort level with WYSIWYG, and whether they know basic HTML or no, it can really impact the editorial experience. So some people may really like the power that this brings, but some people may find this really, really complex, especially if you start adding many components and many inline components into your articles. So, and again, this is definitely not suitable for a decoupled front end, because the way WYSIWYGs are meant for a coupled implementation, because the way you set up your components within a WYSIWYG, translating that information into a decoupled application is a different challenge altogether. So I wouldn't recommend this approach if you're considering using a decoupled setup. But this kind of approach is typically what you would see in articles such as these, right? So this is an example of a long form article or a page where you can see within the different paragraphs you have uh, a video here, you may get a couple of images here. So this is really flexible and really powerful. But as I said, depending on how comfortable the editors are, they may or may not find this easy to use. Somebody may find this very complex. And the fourth approach that we'll talk about today is the layout builder approach. This is the by far the most flexible approach, uh, in the sense that this allows your editors to create regions and manipulate templates on the fly. So they can create multi-column regions on their page as they go along, and they can pull in components. So just like approach two, just like the paragraphs approach, layout builder also means that your components are reusable, so which is great. Which means there's a lot of flexibility, which means you can accommodate changes easily. You can add new components to your component library, and keep on expanding the library. So this definitely gives the highest level of per page control to the editors. Where this approach might fail, or some of the shortcomings of this approach, is that the components that you keep on adding to your page, they are not explicitly connected to your the page, or node as you call it in Drupal. So you do have to do a lot of a couple of extra queries and do some legwork to, for example, again, if you want to expose this as an API, or if you want to see what components have been added to a page programmatically, you do have to go through a couple of extra hoops to get that information. Unlike paragraphs, which is much easier, you can simply get what paragraphs have been added to a particular node. Uh, Another challenge to this approach, just like approach number three, just like entity embed, is that this does not enforce any consistency. So depending on how your design team, how much control your design team wants on the website, on the web, on these pages, this approach may or may not be great. So if there's a very consistent design that has been that is desirable for a website, your editors, you may not want to expose this kind of capability to an editor, because they can change the layout as they like, and you may end up with some undesirable results. So let's jump into a a demo of the layout builder. So as I mentioned, this is one of the most flexible approaches, and the easy content homepage that we have here right now is built using the layout builder. So you can see at the top, I have this hero component followed by a card component. Then we have uh, a form component and some featured insights articles at the bottom. So the way layout builder works is slightly different from the panels implementation, or all the three implementations that we've talked about till now, right? In all of those options, the editors would typically work in the CMS backend. They would manipulate and add content to the node edit form. But in this case, on the front end, you get a drag and drop layout builder interface. So as soon as I click the layout button, I am able to see some additional options over here. And what these options allow me to do is I can add sections on the fly. So as I mentioned, if I click on add sections, I can add a one column or a two column, three column, four column. These are some of the options that you get. And once you've added the sections, within a section, you can add your components. So here you can see I can add a block. I can create a new component using one of my component libraries. So let's quickly test this out. So as you can see, I've added a demo map component here. Now the flexibility, as you can see here, and this is something that you will miss in your paragraph approach, is that here you can uh, very easily add different regions. So right now this is a 50% column, left column. The map component is the left column. I can simply drag and drop it to a full width section as well if needed. So if I drag it here, it then becomes a full width component. Now to do something like this in paragraph, you would have to add these kind of options, left align, right align, maybe a left column, a right column to your content type, which is not desirable, because then again, you get into a situation where your front end is dictating your content type model. And then again, if you change your design, your developers will have to rebuild your content types, and that content type may not be relevant to the new design. So that is why for one-off pages, for landing home pages, and pages where you need to complete control, using the layout builder is a great fit. So we've covered 4 different approaches to do this in Drupal. To conclude, I would say the right approach varies for each project. So as we've already talked about, you can build a same page using one of these 4 approaches, right? But what you have to look at is the editorial experience, how comfortable your editors are using the WYSIWYG editor, for example. Do they like the layout builder interface? Would they be able to work with it? Uh, how much control does the design team want on the layouts of the pages that are being built? All that dictates the right approach for your project. And what we see in most of the large projects is actually a combination of these techniques, right? So your homepage, for example, uh, may be built using the layout builder, right? But more structured content like case studies and blogs, you may use the template switching for that, or you may use paragraphs for that. And we've seen that in easy content that I was just demoing. That's the way we approach it as well. The homepage is maintained using the layout builder, but our articles are maintained using the paragraphs. And what is essential is to keep in mind, if you're using a combination of these approaches, is to make sure that your components are reusable, right? And that is something that Drupal is really great at. If you use the right modules and if you build the components in a proper manner, you can also look at integrating something like Pattern Labs, which is a front end style guide. You can integrate that with your Drupal theme, to make sure that a lot of your components are reusable and you're not doing rebuilding these components from scratch if you have to switch between, say, a layout builder and a paragraph approach. I can quickly give an example of that here in easy content. So as you might have noticed while I was giving this demo, this hero component over here and this card component, I had created exactly the same page using paragraphs as well over here. And if I edit this page, so these are the hero component here is a block, uh, and you can see I get a set of fields over here, which is a title. If I click on the card, I get the option to fix the title, media, summary. We have exactly the same component in our paragraph approach as well. And both of them refer to the same front end template using Pattern Labs, as I mentioned. So we're able to reuse the front end that we built. So even if you have to change the approach or if you have to use a combination of the approach, the content model itself is reusable and the front end is also reusable. So you can see we are using exactly the same content model. You have the title, short title, media, subhead, summary, URL fields here, and you have the same set of fields in our layout builder custom block approach as well. So this is really important, and that is why spending time on your content model, documenting it in maybe an Excel sheet or some other place is really essential, because that does not change. Whether you're using the block approach or your paragraph approach, the crux and the core of your content model really does not change, and it really doesn't change even if you change your CMS, right? And that should be the end goal. So that's why working on your content model, uh, trying to build it in a way that's decoupled with your front end as much as it's possible and feasible is some of the things that you should strive for in any CMS project. And that about concludes the slides that I had today. There are a couple of good resources that I would recommend. So one is, of course, if you want a demo of the easy content distribution that I showed today, and if you want to check out some of the other features that we have there, or if you want to know more about any of these approaches or want to do a deep dive, we're available at easycontent.srijan.net. So please go ahead, check it out, and there's a contact form there that you can fill in. And another very good resource is a great blog post that was written by Jeff Eaton on this topic. So he details out all these four approaches in great length in his blog post. So do check that out as well. That has some really great information and commentary on these different approaches. So at this point, Nilanjana, we can get into any questions if we have any.
Okay, sure. So I think it's a good time to tell our listeners that if you have not put in your questions up till this point, you can give us your questions now, and we can take them up with Ishan. While that happens, a couple of questions that sort of would also like to hear a little more about is so out of the four approaches that you sort of listed out, is there also sort of a cost comparison or time comparison that can be done in terms of while making the choice out of any of these four solutions?
Uh, the way I would say, Niranja, is yes. I mean, there is a cost comparison, but it's more long term. As I said, it's not just the immediate cost of building a project, and that is actually not. We should not be looking at that as the only parameter here, because you may save some time in developing your site uh, using one of these approaches, but then that may lead to more costs down the line when you have to add new features or you have to another redesign, right? So what I would say is we need to consider what sort of flexibility is needed, what kind of changes that you anticipate in your website. Depending on that, we should take the right decision. So for example, if you don't anticipate a lot of changes, if there are just minor changes between the templates, entity embed, the first approach of just using Drupal core might work really well. But if you know that there is a requirement of the marketing team, for example, they will be creating landing pages regularly after the site goes live, then you would need something like the layout builder or paragraphs, even if you need to spend some more time during the initial build.
Okay, understood. So, out of these four approaches, which one would you say is one of the most editor friendly, or sort of gives them a lot of power over how much they can do by themselves without sort of having to constantly keep going back to the development or the technical team?
That's a very subjective thing, in my opinion, to be honest, because different people, depending on their comfort level, their skill set, may prefer one approach over the other. But for me, I would say the layout builder and the paragraph approaches are the top two approaches, because I think they strike the right balance between uh, the editorial experience as well as the flexibility, right? The A lot of people might prefer the approach number three, which is the entity embed, because people are really used to using the Wysiwyg editor, right? And they may think, this is all I need to know, especially if they know a little bit of HTML. They would be very comfortable using this approach. But this approach, I believe, is not really scalable, especially if you look at multi-channel distribution. If you're especially considering maybe a decoupled setup, or you want to expose your content to different channels, it may become a bit challenging here. And then also what we've seen here is that this might be very flexible. It also doesn't let you impose some sort of design restrictions, right? And things can go out of hand. So I think the paragraph and layout builder approaches strike the right balance between design consistency and power to the editors and the editorial experience.
Okay. So, another sort of key question that's coming up is that you went through a bit of the easy content experience, easy content demo as well. So, is there anything especially stand out about easy content that you would sort of want to go into, or sort of want to talk about more in detail, or how exactly does it sort of help out people who are maybe starting up a Drupal site, or how much of a benefit does it bring to the editors if they're using something like easy content?
Sure, I can touch about a couple of things which are relevant to content modeling. So one is, as I mentioned, we are with easy content, you get uh, all these four approaches set up, so you can choose the right, or you can choose the right combination for your project. And one thing that I showed earlier on, how you can share components and how you build components, how you approach the front end using something like Pattern Labs or a design library, so that uh, switching between one approach and then another, you're still able to reuse the content model and reuse the front end template. So that is one benefit that easy content brings. Another benefit is that we've actually uh, integrated the layout builder with decoupled applications, right? So I'll see if I can quickly pull that up. But what we've done is that, as I said, using paragraphs, it's really important, simple, and most of the decoupled applications, you'll see people managing their landing pages, or even articles and things like that, using the paragraphs, because it's really easy to expose in an API and easy to consume in a front end React application. But what we've done here is that we've also integrated the layout builder with React and Angular applications. So here, for example, is a Drupal page that is set up using the layout builder, like I was showing before. And you can see you have the tweet component on the left, and you have a map component on the right. And you can see I have set this up using the layout builder. So you can see there is a tweet on the left and layout builder on the right. Now here is Angular application. This is not Drupal. This is an Angular application which is completely decoupled. But this front end is reading the layout builder configuration, and I'm able to set the page here using the layout builder. I can move the map to the left, for example, and I'll move the tweet to the right, and I'll hit save in Drupal. And if this is working as expected, you will see uh, the change happening real time on the Angular application as well. So the map should move to the left and the tweet should move to the right because we made that change here on Drupal. So as you can see, the map has moved to the left. So we've actually done some, this is something that will not be available out of the box. There are some changes that you have to do. Plus, it also depends on how you set up your Angular app or a React app. But this is something that Easy Content has, and we can definitely talk more about this. So those are a couple of things I would say are the advantages that we've been focusing on Easy Content.
Okay, all right. I think that was a pretty detailed demo, and I think, as you said, if people want to know or want to get a more in-depth demo of easy content, they can definitely go into the resources section and sort of sign themselves up for that. So I think for today, that's sort of all the questions we have. But as always, you can sort of mail us your questions or tweet them out to us at the Srijan handle, or mail them at webinars@srijan.net, and we can have Ishan take them up and share the answers to that. I think with that would come to an end of this particular session. Ishan, thank you very much for sort of taking us through that, and thank you all our listeners for joining us tonight. We would You would have a recording of this entire session in your inboxes by this time tomorrow, as well as a link to Ishan's presentation if you would like to sort of go over that again. And we would keep you updated about any of our next webinars. With that, this is Nilanjana signing off. Thank you for joining us today.